I was still in a hospital gown, 12 hours after giving birth, when my mother-in-law leaned over my son's bassinet and told the nurse to write her name down as his guardian. "A single mother can't raise a boy properly," she said, not even lowering her voice, like I was already gone from the room. Then she set a folder of papers on my tray table, right next to my water cup, and told me to sign away my parental rights. She said it the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. My name is Reagan Voss. I was 29 years old, and 6 hours earlier I had been pushing my son into the world alone, because his father, my husband, Holt, had died 4 months before his due date. And I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of the story. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry in front of her. I picked up that folder with my hands still shaking from the epidural wearing off, and I read every single word on every single page. And that was the moment I decided Marguerite Voss was going to lose everything she used to try to take my son from me. If you're new to this channel, my name is Sophie, and every day I bring you real, raw stories of betrayal and the justice that follows. Stay until the end, because this one has a twist in the final 10 minutes that even I didn't see coming until it happened to me. Let's get into it. Holt and I met at a fundraising gala neither of us wanted to attend. I was there covering event photography for a non-profit. He was there because his mother had bought a table and insisted he make an appearance and be useful for once. We ended up hiding by the dessert table complaining about canapés, and 3 years later we were married in a courthouse with 2 witnesses, because Marguerite refused to fund or attend a wedding to, in her words, a girl who photographed strangers' birthday parties for a living. Marguerite Voss was old money in the way that mattered to her more than anything else in the world. Her late husband had built a chain of regional pharmacies before selling them for a fortune, and she had spent the 20 years since managing that fortune like a queen managing a kingdom that was, in her mind, constantly under siege from outsiders. Holt was her only child. I was, from day one, the outsider. She never screamed. She never slammed doors. Marguerite's weapon was always the quiet comment dropped at exactly the right moment to make you feel small in front of other people. At our wedding dinner, which she did attend after all, just 3 months late and on her own terms, she raised a glass and said, "Well, Holt always did like a project." Holt apologized for her constantly. He also, and I understand this now more than I did then, never once stood up to her in the moment. He'd wait until we were alone in the car and say, "I'm sorry, she doesn't mean it like that," which is a sentence I've come to believe is one of the most damaging things you can say to someone you love, because it teaches them their pain isn't allowed to exist in the room where it happened. We built a good life anyway. Holt worked as a structural engineer, quiet and steady, the opposite of his mother in every way except one. He hated conflict just as much as she loved creating it. When I got pregnant, he cried in the parking lot of the drugstore before we even got back in the car. He wanted to name our son after his grandfather, Wesley, a man Marguerite rarely mentioned because Wesley had apparently been kind, and kindness was not a Voss family trait she chose to preserve. 5 months into my pregnancy, Holt was driving home from a job site outside the city when another driver ran a red light. He was gone before I got the phone call. I was 5 months pregnant, standing in my kitchen holding my phone, and the only thought I remember clearly is that I would never hear him apologize for his mother again, and somehow that felt like its own kind of grief on top of the grief. Marguerite came to the funeral in black Chanel and told me, in front of 40 guests, that she hoped I would at least have the sense to give the baby his real family name properly, as though I had ever intended to do anything else. That was the moment I understood grief was not going to soften her. If anything, it gave her an opening. For the rest of my pregnancy, Marguerite inserted herself everywhere. She showed up to 2 of my prenatal appointments without asking, introducing herself to my doctor as the baby's grandmother and guardian, a title nobody had given her and one my doctor, thankfully, corrected on the spot. She sent a lawyer's letter, not to me, but to my doctor's office, expressing the family's concern about my ability to provide financially and emotionally for a child alone, and requesting to be listed as an emergency contact with full medical decision authority. I found out about that letter because my doctor's office manager called me, confused, asking if I wanted to authorize it. I did not. 2 weeks later, a woman I didn't recognize showed up at my apartment complex asking my downstairs neighbor questions. How often I had visitors, whether I seemed stable, whether I had steady income. My neighbor called me the moment the woman left, telling me it had felt less like small talk and more like an interview. It took me 3 days of asking around to learn the woman had been a private investigator. Marguerite wasn't just worried about me. She was building a file. I called Holt's aunt for the first time in years after that, mostly out of desperation, just to ask if any of this was normal. She was kind but strangely distant on the phone, and she told me only that she wasn't in a position to get involved in family matters anymore. I didn't understand what that meant yet. I would later, and it would matter more than I could have guessed. I should have seen the pattern building. I didn't, because I was 32 weeks pregnant, grieving my husband, and trying to survive on savings and half a freelance photography income. Marguerite understood exactly how exhausted and vulnerable that made me, and she used it. My son was born 3 weeks early, on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with Holt's same stubborn chin. I named him Wesley after his great-grandfather, the one Voss that Marguerite never spoke ill of, mostly because she never spoke of him at all. Marguerite arrived at the hospital less than 2 hours after I gave birth. She had, I later learned, called ahead and told the front desk she was the family. A volunteer escorted her up to the maternity floor after she identified herself as my late husband's mother, without anyone confirming she had any actual authority to be there. She walked into my recovery room holding a gift bag in one hand and a folder in the other, and she set the gift bag down first, like a peace offering before the ambush. "A single mother can't raise a boy properly," she told the nurse who was checking my vitals, gesturing at Wesley's bassinet. "I'll need to be listed as his guardian on the paperwork. It's already been discussed with the family's attorney." The nurse, to her credit, looked at me first. I was exhausted, sore, running on almost no sleep, and I said the only thing I had the strength for, "Absolutely not. I am his mother. I am the only guardian he has." Marguerite didn't argue with me directly. She smiled, thanked the nurse, and sat down in the chair beside my bed like she had all the time in the world. Then she opened the folder and slid it onto my tray table. "These are just some documents to make things easier while you get back on your feet," she said. "Temporary guardianship transfer, just so I can help with medical and financial decisions until you're stable. It's not permanent. It's just practical." I picked up the folder with hands that were still trembling from the epidural wearing off, and I started to read. It was not temporary. It was not practical. Page 3 was a full petition for legal guardianship of my son, naming Marguerite Voss as primary guardian and me as a secondary contact, pending review. Page 5 was a waiver releasing me from decision-making authority over Wesley's medical care, education, and finances until he turned 18. Buried in the fine print of page 6 was a clause transferring control of a trust fund that Holt had set up for our son, a trust fund I hadn't even known the full size of, into an account managed solely by Marguerite, for the child's benefit. I looked up at her. She was watching me with a calm, patient expression of a woman who had done this kind of thing before, and expected it to work exactly the way it always had. "I need you to leave," I told her. "Reagan, be reasonable," she said. "You have no job security, no family support of your own nearby, and frankly, no experience raising a boy. I raised Holt. I know what it takes." I looked down at my son, asleep in his bassinet with his father's chin, and I said the words that I think surprised even me with how steady they came out. "You raised a man who apologized for you his entire life instead of standing up to you once. I am not signing anything. And I want you out of this room before I call security." She left. But she didn't stop. That night, alone in the recovery room with Wesley asleep in the bassinet beside me, I called the nurse back in and asked her, quietly, if what Marguerite had said about guardian designations was even something a family member could just walk in and request. The nurse, a woman named Priscilla who had been kind to me all day, sat down for a moment and told me something I've never forgotten. "Ma'am, nobody in this hospital has the authority to change who your son's guardian is except you. Whatever she told you, That decision belongs to you and only you. It was such a small sentence, but it was the first solid ground I'd stood on in weeks, and I held on to it the entire night, replaying it every time I started to doubt myself. I didn't sleep. I lay there running my thumb along the edge of that folder, reading the same paragraphs over and over by the light of my phone, trying to understand how a woman could walk into a room where her own grandson had been born hours earlier and treat it like a business transaction. I thought about Holt, about the way he used to go quiet in the passenger seat after every visit to his mother's house, and for the first time I understood that quiet wasn't peace. It was practice. He had been rehearsing surrender his entire life, and I was not going to teach my son the same lesson. 3 days after I brought Wesley home, I was served with formal guardianship petition papers at my front door. Marguerite had filed with the family court, claiming I was emotionally and financially unstable, citing my husband's recent death, my freelance income, and, this is the part that made my hands shake with rage instead of exhaustion, a claim that I had a documented history of postpartum mental health instability, based on absolutely nothing except a single conversation she'd overheard between me and my OB about normal postpartum symptoms she was never supposed to be in the room for in the first place. I called every friend I had. Most of them told me to get a lawyer immediately, which I could not afford. But one friend, Odalise, who I'd known since college, put me in touch with a family law attorney named Naomi Strand, who agreed to take my case on a reduced fee because, as she told me in our first phone call, this is one of the more aggressive overreach attempts I've seen in years, and I want to see her lose. Naomi's first move was simple. She requested every document Marguerite had filed, plus the records from the hospital about who had accessed my patient information and under what authority. What we found changed everything. Marguerite had never been granted any legal authority at the hospital. The intake staffer who let her in as the family hadn't verified anything, and once the hospital's risk management team reviewed the incident, they confirmed in writing that no guardian designation had ever legally existed. The folder she handed me in recovery was a set of documents her own attorney had drafted, never filed, never approved by any court at that point. She had been bluffing, betting that a grieving, exhausted new mother wouldn't read closely enough to notice the papers had no case number, no judge's signature, nothing binding at all. Only after I refused did she actually go file a real petition, days later, scrambling to make her bluff retroactively true. That was the first crack. But before we found it, there was a week where I almost stopped fighting altogether. It was the week my freelance clients started canceling. 2 of them, without much explanation, emailed to say they decided to go a different direction for their event photography needs. A third told me, awkwardly, over the phone, that someone claiming to represent the Voss family had reached out to ask about my reliability and professionalism. I sat on my kitchen floor that night with Wesley asleep against my chest, my savings account dwindling, a guardianship hearing looming, and for about an hour, I genuinely considered calling Marguerite and asking what it would take to make this stop. I didn't call her. Instead, I called Naomi, sobbing, telling her I didn't know how much longer I could hold on financially. Naomi didn't offer sympathy first. She offered a plan. This is exactly the kind of pressure someone applies when they're worried the truth won't hold up on its own, she told me. She's not attacking your parenting. She's attacking your ability to survive long enough to fight her. Don't let her turn exhaustion into a confession. I wrote that sentence down on a sticky note and put it on my refrigerator, and I looked at it every single day until the hearing. The second crack came from the trust fund. Naomi subpoenaed the trust documents Holt had set up before he died, and what we found was something Marguerite clearly hadn't expected anyone to look at closely. Holt hadn't just set up a modest fund for Wesley's future, he had moved a significant portion of an inheritance from his own father into an irrevocable trust, naming me as trustee, not his mother, specifically because, as his handwritten notes attached to the trust document stated, he did not want his mother to have any financial leverage over decisions involving our children. He had known. Somewhere in the quiet way he avoided conflict with her, some part of Holt had understood exactly what his mother was capable of, and he had protected us from it before he even knew he wouldn't be here to do it in person. Marguerite's guardianship petition wasn't really about my parenting ability at all. It was about control of that trust. If she became Wesley's legal guardian, she could argue in court that trustee decisions should default to her as his caretaker. The entire guardianship filing was a financial maneuver dressed up as concern for a baby's well-being. The third crack was the one that finished it. Naomi's investigator, digging into the family's history, found that this wasn't the first time Marguerite had done something like this. 22 years earlier, after her own husband, Holt's father, passed away, she had attempted to challenge his will, claiming his sister, Holt's aunt, was unfit to manage a smaller trust left to her, using almost identical language. Unstable, unreliable, incapable of handling money responsibly. That case had settled quietly out of court, with Holt's aunt agreeing to reduced contact with the family in exchange for Marguerite dropping the challenge. Holt's aunt had barely spoken to the family since. I had always assumed it was just distance. It wasn't distance. It was a pattern. 10 days before the hearing, Marguerite's attorney reached out to Naomi requesting a private mediation. I almost refused, but Naomi thought it was worth hearing her out, if only to understand her strategy before we walked into court. We met in a conference room at Naomi's office, neutral ground. Marguerite arrived in a pale blue suit, calm and composed, and set a single sheet of paper on the table before either lawyer had even sat down. It was a settlement offer, a monthly payment, generous on paper, in exchange for me agreeing to joint decision-making authority over Wesley's education and finances until he turned 18, with Marguerite named as co-trustee of the fund Holt had left him. "This doesn't have to be adversarial," she said, folding her hands in front of her the way she always did when she wanted to look reasonable. "I only want what's best for that boy. Surely we can agree on that much." I looked at the number on the page for a long moment, thinking about my dwindling savings, the cancelled clients, the exhaustion I'd been carrying for months. And then I thought about Holt's handwritten note in that trust file, the one where he'd written, in his own hand, that he didn't want his mother to have any leverage over decisions involving our children. I slid the paper back across the table. "You didn't come here for Wesley," I told her. "You came here for the trust. And you're not getting either one." Her expression didn't change, but her attorney's did, just slightly, and I understood in that moment that she truly hadn't expected me to say no a second time. The court date came 5 months after Wesley was born. I remember dressing him in a small collared onesie that morning, my hands still not quite steady, and thinking that whatever happened in that courtroom, I already knew who I was as his mother, and no filing cabinet full of paperwork could take that away from me. Marguerite's attorney opened by painting me exactly the way I expected. Young, recently widowed, financially precarious, alone. It was almost convincing, if you didn't know the truth sitting underneath it. Naomi's response was quiet and devastating. She laid out the hospital's own written statement confirming Marguerite had misrepresented her authority to access my medical information, watching the judge's pen pause over the page as she read it. She presented the trust documents showing Holt's explicit written intent to keep his mother from ever holding financial control over our son, and she read his handwritten note aloud, slowly, letting every word land in a courtroom that had gone completely silent. Marguerite's attorney tried to object, calling the note an informal document with no legal bearing on guardianship. The judge overruled him almost before he finished the sentence, telling him plainly that a deceased father's documented intent regarding his own child was more than relevant, it was central. Then Naomi called Holt's aunt to the stand. I watched Marguerite's posture change the moment her sister-in-law walked into the room, the first time in the entire proceeding that she looked less than completely composed. Holt's aunt spoke carefully, describing the will challenge from 22 years earlier almost word for word the way Naomi's investigator had reconstructed it, the same accusations of instability, the same quiet settlement, the same silence that followed for 2 decades. When Marguerite's attorney asked her, sharply, why she was only coming forward now, she looked directly at Marguerite for the first time since taking the stand and said, "Because nobody stood up to her the first time. Someone finally did. And I wasn't going to let her do it again without saying something." I watched the judge's expression change as she spoke. This wasn't a woman describing a single misunderstanding. This was a documented pattern of a wealthy matriarch using guardianship and competency claims as a financial weapon against every woman who stood between her and control of family money. The judge dismissed Marguerite's guardianship petition entirely. Full parental rights and sole trusteeship were affirmed as mine, exactly as Holt had intended. The judge went further than I expected, actually. She later entered an order requiring Marguerite to reimburse my legal fees in full, citing the petition as filed in bad faith, and issued a formal warning that any future attempt to interfere with my medical or parental authority over Wesley without legal standing would result in a protective order. Marguerite did not look at me on the way out of the courtroom. I didn't need her to. Priscilla, the nurse from that first night, texted me a week later. She'd still had my number from my discharge paperwork. Somehow the story had made its way back through hospital staff, the way things do, and she just wanted to say she was glad I'd trusted my own judgment over a stranger's confidence in a hospital gown. It's strange, the people who end up mattering in a story like this, not just the lawyers and the judges, but a nurse who told a grieving new mother, quietly and firmly, that the decision was still hers. It's been 8 months since that day in the hospital when she set a folder on my tray table and told a nurse I wasn't fit to raise my own son. Wesley is crawling now, fast enough that I have to watch him like a hawk in the kitchen. He has Holt's chin and more every day, Holt's calm, steady way of looking at the world, like he's already decided nothing is going to rattle him. I still think about that sentence sometimes. A single mother can't raise a boy properly, not because it hurt me anymore, but because I've realized it was never really about me at all. It was about a woman who had spent her whole life mistaking control for love, and who ran out of people willing to hand it to her quietly. Holt's aunt reached back out a few months ago. We've started having dinner together every few weeks. She told me once that watching me refuse to sign those papers in that hospital room was the first time in 22 years she'd seen anyone in this family say no to Marguerite Voss and mean it. I think about the folder sometimes, sitting on that tray table next to my water cup, 12 hours after giving birth. I think about how close I came to being too exhausted, too grieving, too overwhelmed to read every page. I think about what would have happened to Wesley's future, and mine, if I had just signed where she told me to sign. So here's my question for you, and I really want to know the answer in the comments. If you were lying in that hospital bed, 12 hours postpartum, with your mother-in-law handing you papers to sign away your own child, would you have had the strength to read every single page first? If this story moved you, hit subscribe, because Sophie Revenge posts a brand new story just like this one every single day.